Right, thank you very much, and thank you for saying about DDD London, because I always forget to mention that. We do online as well as in person, so if you're not near London, you can look us up and find us online as well. Okay, we are here for design patterns for software diagramming. Who is ready for the post-lunch talk? Try it again. Who is ready for the post-lunch talk? Now you're ready. Okay. Right, so, as Hannah said, I am Jacqui Reed. I'm also the author of Communication Patterns with O'Reilly, and I am the, principal architect of the Ministry of Software Design. So if you want to find me, you can find me on my website and on socials. Now, some of you probably have seen diagrams that are a little bit like this one. So we've got boxes everywhere, we've got different colors. Anyone know what they mean? Nope. We've got a bit of a lack of labeling as well. There's nothing on any of these lines what they mean. Some of them don't even have arrows, so you don't know anything about this. And some of you might recognize this kind of diagram, where we've got even the people who drew it probably can't remember actually what it means, let alone explain it to anyone else. Or maybe you get presented with things like this, where you can't actually read it. And someone's talking about a bit, and you can't read it, you can't remember what they said, and it's not very useful. Or how about ones like this? Now, this has got a slight problem in the middle there, which I'm not going to cover today. Do not touch the mainframe. But we've got some problems with this one here as well. We've got lots of things all over the place, and we don't know what any of it means because it's not explained to us. And so I'm going to talk to you about effective visual communication today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some patterns and anti-patterns, because people in tech understand patterns and anti-patterns for code and for architecture. So our patterns are things that work in most situations. It's not a law, but it will work for most situations. Then the anti-patterns are the things that quite often look like they're a good option, but actually their downsides outweigh any pros that they've got. And we're going to use these to avoid diagram pitfalls, and we're going to deliver impact and actually communicate with people, communicate understanding. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is that the actual style of your diagrams communicates something to people. This is the same diagram, but it's got two different styles. We've got number 1, which is more of a sketchy style, and we've got number 2, more formal style. Now, I think you agree that number 2 looks like it's a more fully developed idea, and number 1 looks like it's this is the beginning of our idea. Now, what you can do is you can use style to communicate with your audience. This one, if you showed this to your, say, product owner at the beginning of your project, you could say, here you go, and they go, oh, great, when's testing going to start? But actually, this is just your first idea, and they think that things are further along than they would otherwise be. But if you'd shown this, they might not have got that idea. But show this to your stakeholders when you're further along in the project, and they might start to think, ooh, are things further behind than we're being told they are? And they might start getting worried. And I call this pattern meta-style, also known as using style to communicate. And I call it meta-style because it's a bit like metadata. We're not specifically communicating this information, but people are getting that information just from looking at our diagram. And what you can do is you can use this style to your advantage. Think, what do I want people to think when they look at my diagram? And also, we can do the converse of that, which is to avoid that miscommunication. Now, it's your turn. Post-lunch, I'm not going to get you to stand up or anything, but which one of these would you use for this diagram? We've got a level 2 data flow diagram, so we're getting down into some detail here. Would you use number 1, which is the more sketchy style, or would you use number 2, which is the more formal style? So hands up if you would use number 1, and hands up if you'd use number 2. Pretty much everyone said number 2. But what if this is when you're just coming up with this idea? What if this is just when we're thinking, okay, we need to go down to the next level, and we're just coming up with an idea? So I'm going to use that classic phrase, it depends. So if you are playing conference bingo, there's one for you. Right, another pattern now. We've got this one called face in the crowd, also known as know your audience. So different audiences are going to need different levels of detail. They're going to need different types of diagram. And you're all thinking, yeah, I know that. That's really obvious. But the trouble is when people create diagrams, they then completely forget this for some reason. So you need to be thinking, who is your diagram for? And there are a few questions you can ask yourself. Some of your diagrams are probably going to be very much business-facing. Others are going to be much more technical-facing. But some are going to be a mixture. And those are the ones that you're really going to need to think about. So here's some thoughts. First of all, what's their technical understanding? Have you got a project manager that's very technical, or are they very non-technical? Is your product owner going to want to know that you've chosen MongoDB, or do they just want to know that you've chosen a database that is going to support the important things for their product? They're not going to know what MongoDB is. Then, what level of detail do they need? Are you presenting to some kind of architecture review board? What kind of detail are they expecting? Are your development teams, are they expecting you to tell them exactly what they're going to do, or very high level and they make all the decisions? So think about what level of detail they're going to need. Then, what do they want from you? What information do they need from you so that they can do what they need to do? Fairly obvious one, that one. But the one that people tend to forget is, what do you want from them? Do you want them to make a decision based on your diagram? Do you want them to actually ask you questions about things? Do you need to make a decision based on their feedback? All these different things. So your turn again. Who is this diagram for? It is a UML class diagram. So just call out who it's for. Developers, engineers? Anyone else? Architects, maybe? There's normally someone who says no one because it's UML. Didn't get that today. Yes, so this is more technical. You show this to someone like a product owner or a project manager, even a BA was going to go, I don't know what that means, especially as it hasn't got a key. Now, a lot of my slides, diagrams don't have keys, but I'm going to tell you about those later. I've just not put them on so you can actually read them. Now, this one is a C4 context diagram. Who is this for? Shout louder. Architects? Stakeholders? Yeah, so this diagram is actually quite flexible. You could show this to technical people. You could show this to non-technical people as well. This is also quite useful for even the developers who are working really far down in the code. Even if this system were some huge distributed system and they're only working on one part of it, it's very useful for people to have an understanding of the high level. And so this diagram is for pretty much anyone, especially if it's got a key. Now, who here has seen domain storytelling or used it? Ooh, a few hands. So domain storytelling is a collaborative way of designing a system or working out how the system currently is. And it uses a pictorial view to map things out. Who do you think this is going to be for? Someone said everyone? Pardon? Yep, product owner. So yes, this is going to be for people who have that domain knowledge, your specialists, your experts. You might get people, as you start to get more technical with these, you might get people like architects or tech leads or senior engineers involved. It's not really so much for developers unless you're really getting a lot lower, which you tend to use other ways of doing that. Okay, an anti-pattern this time. I call this multi-story diagram, or mixing levels of abstraction. Now, mixing levels of abstraction tends to be a bit of a sin in coding. And we tend to separate our levels of abstraction doing things like layered architecture, which we've got a couple of examples here. We also use modules, we use methods, we use functions, we use services and things if we're doing distributed. We also do this in architecture. So C4, as I just told you, I showed you that context diagram. That is the very high level. And then the next level down, you have a container diagram. And then when you break that down, you get component and code. You tend to only use the top two of these. Those are the most common. And then some of our frameworks for architecture, like SABSA, which is a security framework, also split things out in different ways. Now, when we have a diagram which has more than one level of abstraction on it, it can become very confusing. So when we get an arrow like this one, where we've got a different level of abstraction at each end of that arrow, it can be a bit confusing. You think, well, what in this part talks to that? Now, as I said, these are patterns and anti-patterns, so in some times you do need to do this. But in general, what we want to do is split those levels of abstraction unless you've got a really good reason not to. So here is the context diagram that I showed you a minute ago. And then we split out into this container diagram as well. And so that dark blue box from the previous slide, so that the dark blue one in the middle, that now becomes this dotted line that we see around here. That dotted line is that same dark blue box. And so we are looking at the next level of detail. Now, if we had all that information from the first diagram, because with context diagram, you may have lots and lots of things around there. We don't want to have all of that at this level of diagram, because there's just too much on there. So what we're looking at here is going down a level, but also thinking, what do we really need? What questions are we answering with this diagram? And you should not be answering every single question with one diagram, because that's when we get these types of diagram that I showed you at the beginning. So mixing those levels of abstraction causes confusion. Do it very, very carefully. Right, one of my favorites here. Now, a slight health and safety warning on this next slide. It's a little bit bright. So the main problem with this diagram isn't even the fact that it's got bright colors on it. You can do bright colors, maybe not quite so many. The main problem is that there's no meaning to those colors. It's just the 6 things on this diagram, I've put 6 colors on. So you may as well have just put 1 color on. I also give you permission to make black and white diagrams, because you don't need to put color. If it doesn't have meaning, you don't need to. You may as well show people this kind of thing when you've got that kind of diagram. All I can say is never ever search for a rainbow unicorn GIF on the internet, because that's about the best you get. Yeah, I'm warning you. Okay, so what we can do here is we can minimize our color palette. as I said, you can just use black and white. You can just use one colour and make everything one colour if you want to make it look a bit nicer. What we can do is we can group or by sort of type or function or whatever it is you need to communicate. So here I've picked just 4 colours because I've got 4 different types, 4 different functions that are being fulfilled here. So what we're doing is we're using colour to aid the communication rather than just sort of splatting it on because we think it should be colourful. Okay, another anti-pattern. This one I call a spider's web, also known as unclear relationships. So apologies if there's anyone who doesn't like spiders. There's only one, I promise. Now, here's another example of the type of diagram you may see regularly. We've got lines all over the place, some of them crossing over each other. We've also got labels like these 2 here, where you can't actually tell which line each label is for. You could not be sure with those. So, we can get a little spider being quite happy in that little web there. So here's some things you can do. First of all, get rid of all the unnecessary information. Don't try and put everything in one diagram. Create different diagrams for different things. So if it's not what you're trying to communicate, you can get rid of it. You can split up diagrams where necessary. Sometimes you've just got too much information. Maybe you've got one service in your distributed system that everything else talks to. Take that service out, create a separate diagram with that service in the middle, and put everything around it. Put a note on the first diagram to say that you have done that, like a little kind of sticky note square bit or something like that. Now, one thing you can also think is, does it need to even be a diagram? If everything is talking to that service, why do I need to put that in a picture and have to then manually update it every time? Why don't I just make a table of everything or a bullet list of everything that connects to that service, and then all I have to do is add something else to the bottom? You could even easily alphabetize it. Really simple. Okay, minimize the line crossing. You can sometimes, if you just move things around a bit, you will find that you have far fewer crossings. Where things do cross, you want to make the line jumps nice and big and obvious. Another tip is that if you've got, say, lots of vertical and lots of horizontal lines, make it so that either all the vertical ones jump or all the horizontal lines jump. It's much easier for people to read if you're consistent with that. Then you can standardize the position of that relationship label, put it in the middle of the arrow, put it at the beginning of the arrow, but make a decision. And I'm going to show you where I'm going to break that rule in a minute. And then you can use angled lines, which are quite often called orthogonal, which means they're not just this diagonal, they've got the 90-degree angles in them. Now, I'm going to show you the difference. We've got the untangled version here, and we've got the tangled version. I will show you the full version of this now. So I've actually managed to make it so there's no line jumps at all in this diagram, just by moving things around. That doesn't always work. The other thing I've done is I've made it so that these are normally at the beginning of an arrow. But sometimes we have to break that rule. Those 2 there, they're not at the beginning. But if you look at that, you can see that if I did put them at the beginning, it wouldn't work very well. They would be very cluttered. So, following all of those makes it much easier to read this diagram. We know where all of those labels go. Now, this is a very odd thing to say, but diagrams are free. Now, Neil Ford likes to say that slides are free when he's talking about creating presentations. So he likes slides like this, which don't have much information on them. I could have just put all this information as loads of bullet points on a slide, but I don't need to, because having more slides is not more expensive than having fewer slides. And the same thing goes for diagrams. Now, some people then say to me, well, wait a minute, it takes longer to create 3 diagrams than it does 1. But what about all the time that is wasted by people misunderstanding that one big diagram and all the questions that get asked about that diagram? And you will actually find that it probably doesn't take longer because that big diagram is awful to maintain. You do not want to have to maintain that. Having 3 diagrams makes it a lot easier. You can see where things are. You can go, okay, I only need to update this one, or maybe you do need to update all of them, but it's much easier to see the information and to update them. So diagrams are free. Right, an anti-pattern, more color. This is all about relying on color to communicate. Now, I talked about how to use color earlier. This is from looking at this from a different angle. Now, I have simulated protanopia, which is a form of color blindness. Only one of these chilies is yellow. You're going to tell me which one it is. Hands up if you think that A is yellow. B? C? D? Okay, most people saying D that time. Right, your turn again. I've simulated tritanopia this time, and I've mixed them up, of course. So, who thinks, and again, one of these is yellow. Who thinks it's E? F? G? H? A lot of you did not put your hand up that time. A bit more difficult, wasn't it? So, first time it was D, the second time it was E. Now if we line these up with the standard colours there in the middle, you can see that when people say, oh, it's easy, you just have to avoid red and green. That's not true. There are lots of different forms of colour blindness. And so some people cannot see a colour at all. Some people can see a colour partially. And there are some people with achromatopsia or monochromacy who cannot see colour at all. That is the most rare form of colour blindness. And it's approximately 4.5% of the world's population, which doesn't sound that much. But it's actually 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women. Now, if you think about the tech industry at the moment, are there more men or women? There are more men at the moment. It's changing a bit, and hopefully it's going to change a bit more. But it means that you are more likely to come across somebody who is colorblind in the tech industry than in some other industries. And if we think about it, it's more than 350 million people worldwide, which is quite a big number. It's more than the total population of the USA. It's about half the population of Europe, if we're looking at people worldwide. Now, there's a few things you can do. If you work with web UIs, the Chrome and Firefox, and probably some others now, have actually built these simulators into the dev tools. Or you can install different ones as well, and you can simulate what it would look like to different people. Now, if you've got a palette, this one's one I just created by pulling out some colors from a picture that I liked. You can then simulate these different types, and you can look at this and go, right, there's my standard version there, but when I simulate this, I can see that there's going to be quite a few people who could very easily confuse these two colors. Now, one easy way of sorting that out is to just get rid of one of those colors. Maybe I only need 4 colors. The other thing that you can do is you can change the saturation of that color, so how bright it is. You'll then need to do another comparison, but the one thing you really can do is have a look at it in monochrome, in grayscale. Because if you can't tell the difference in grayscale, then you're probably going to have a problem somewhere. So the first thing you can use is a colorblind simulator if you've already got a palette. Now, most companies are quite good at having a formal palette which has been checked in this case. But it's always worth checking it, especially if it's one that's not a formal palette. The other thing you need to do is don't assume that software that has these nice color swatches and color palettes in it has been checked. These are two colors from the Draw.io standard colors. And when I simulate Deuteranopia, you cannot tell the difference between those two colors. Pastels do not work. They are all the same saturation. Now, if we look at the color deficiency friendly version I've got, we can simulate that and they look very different to each other. So do not assume that Visio or Draw.io or Miro or whatever you are using has got a colorblind friendly palette. Now the big message here is do not rely on color alone. You can use a color simulator, but what it's better to do is to think, what else could I use instead? Now I've got a graph here. I've put a key in, so this must be okay, except if we look at it in grayscale. Now, a lot of diagrams are not going to be printed in grayscale these days, but don't trust on that. When I wrote my book, the paper version is in grayscale, so I had to make sure that every diagram looked okay in grayscale. One thing you can do is you can just use pattern. You just need to make sure that there's enough contrast between the pattern and the background. Another thing you can do is use symbols. I could have used some color with my ticks and crosses for my patterns and anti-patterns, but I chose not to. Now, I do sometimes see people where they've got a slide and they're showing you either an anti-pattern or what not to do, and they've got a red border around it, and then the next one is a green border for what you should do. But some people can't see the difference between that. So, use symbols. Right, a few things summarizing here. Use patterns, symbols. You can use labels on things as well. Labels are always good, either along with your color or just get rid of the color if you don't want it. Choose colors with different saturation levels, how kind of bright the color is. You can use that simulation tool. There are plenty of free ones out there if you want to use them. You can also think about things like monitor and projector color calibration. Now, I gave this talk once where I was in the middle and I had a screen on each side, and it perfectly illustrated this with the chili peppers because they were different colors on each screen. It was great. So when you're saying, oh yes, so the yellow boxes, and people are like, there's not any yellow up there, there's a sort of browny color, consider that. And then, of course, consider if your diagram is going to end up in grayscale. Not that likely these days, but as I said, grayscale is a bit of an acid test for checking if people will be able to differentiate the colors that you are using. Right, a pattern this time. I call this one written in legend, also known as use a key or legend. Now, I mentioned this earlier. The reason I don't have the legends is because of space, but this is what you should be doing. So what you really need to do is imagine that your audience does not have the information that's in your head. And it's really, really difficult to do because the more knowledge you've got, the more you forget what it's like to be a beginner or a novice. So don't rely on your audience having specific knowledge. Now, really, this is going to be a balancing act because what you don't want to do is kind of annoy people by telling them things that they think are really basic and obvious. You can think of this a little bit as ramps and steps. We've got a ramp there which allows people to get up to the other top level, but there's also some steps because maybe people can use the steps and using them will be quicker or easier for where they want to get to. Now, sometimes we've got icons like this and we've picked them because they're really obvious. It's really obvious what all of these icons mean to ourselves. Other people may get the wrong idea. So what we really, really need to do is make things explicit. Put that key or legend in. Say what the numbers mean, because You know that those numbers are the order. Other people might think that it's the priority or something else. People will just make stuff up that they want to see. So really do not leave things open for interpretation, because what we would quite like to get into production is what's in the diagram, not someone's interpretation of what's in the diagram. UML, everybody knows UML, don't they? I don't think they ever did, to be honest. So we really need to put a key in for UML, because there are some real oddities in UML that you think, well, wait a minute, why is the arrow pointing in that direction? It's a bit weird. But now look, I've got a horribly cluttered screen. So there's two things you can do here. The first is that we could just put this part of the key on, because that is all we need for this diagram. The second thing you can do is, if you have got this in a wiki or something like that, is that you can hide it away. Maybe when somebody clicks on that link, it just opens up, or it could open up in another tab if you need to. Or maybe it's open and people can just click it to close it if they don't need it. So we can declutter these things. Right, C4, I said that this was really good even without a key, but you should have a key for it, especially when you start getting down into the lower levels. So this one is at the container level, and we're starting to use things like databases. We've got some queues here, and so people really need to know what those are. Oh, we've also got an extra one up there. We have got a UI there. So we need that differentiation. And there we go. Now, if you use something like diagrams as code with C4, you can use Structurizer, which is completely built for it. And the really good thing about Structurizer is that it will actually generate the key for you. Everything that's in that diagram, it will put in a key. Really handy. If you're using something like Plant UML or Mermaid, which are very useful for diagrams as code, they are really difficult to get a key into. And considering they've been around for so long, I don't understand it, but it's pretty difficult to do it. So what we're doing here is we're limiting our assumptions in the same way we would if we were designing and architecting software. If you're making assumptions, you should be writing them down, and you should be finding that information out and getting those signed off, getting people to say, yes, that's true, no, it's this instead, or okay, we're just going to have to keep that assumption for now. So limit your assumptions as to what your audience is going to understand. Okay, an anti-pattern now. This one's good. MLAH, also known as multiple letter acronym HELL. Sorry, I created a new acronym. Big message here. Only use defined acronyms. Do not assume people know what it means. Some things you can do. When you are speaking, you can say the acronym and you can say the definition straight afterwards. Now, what a lot of people might do is, if they think someone's not going to understand the acronym, they will just say the long version. But you are then robbing that person of that learning opportunity to learn what those mean, because then the next person they talk to uses the acronym by itself and they still don't understand. When you are writing, you can define that acronym the first time you use it. Now, if it's something that's quite short, you probably only need to do it once. If it's something that's quite big, you may need to do it at the beginning of each chapter or the beginning of each section, that kind of thing. You can also put terms in a glossary, of course, and then if you're using a wiki, you can create a hyperlink to it, which will open it in the glossary if people need that. And if you're creating diagrams, you can put things in the key, because acronyms are quite useful for saving space in diagrams. But if you are creating a context map, do you write downstream and upstream all over your diagram? No, you write a D for downstream and a U for upstream. In your key, put D downstream, you upstream, so that people definitely know what it is. Okay, your turn again. I think this is why this is the after lunch talk. What does DRY stand for? Don't repeat yourself. Very good. What about DFD? Data flow diagram. Well done, someone paying attention. SPA, single page application, and BLT. Yes, bacon, lettuce, and tomato. Or is it business leadership team? Or basic language translator? Bulk loading tool? Be like that? See? Could be pretty much anything, because different acronyms can mean different things to different people. Even if they are in the same domain, you could have both be in the finance domain, and someone else just thinks that it means something else. So it's really easy to fall into this idea that people have the same understanding as you, because you kind of live in your own head, and things mostly make sense in your own head. I hope they do anyway. But everybody has very unique lived experiences. And so don't assume that other people have the same understanding as you. You may have found this when you try to explain something to someone and they don't understand it. And so you go down a level and you explain something that underpins that, but then they don't understand that either. And you end up with this whole sort of house of cards that you have to build to explain things to people. And it can be quite difficult to do that, but also you should feel good about that, because it shows that you have learnt a lot of stuff in your career and your life. So next time you use an acronym, you can think SIDI, which means state it, define it. No, I'm not trying to make up another acronym, but I did just follow it. So make sure you are defining your acronyms. Okay, a pattern, a push in the right direction, also known as match the diagram flow to expectations. Now this really applies to all diagrams, because even if it's a structural diagram, there is going to be some flow of information in there. Now, we might have a diagram like this. Now, we normally read left to right, at least in Western languages. And so we expect to hopefully start the diagram somewhere on the left. But for this one, the diagram starts over here in the bottom right. Not particularly useful. This is exactly the same diagram, but it's much easier for people to read. It starts over here on the left, and then we've got requests going from left to right, and we've got responses generally going right to left. It's much easier for people to read this diagram because we've matched their expectations. And we don't want people to have to work to read our diagrams, because either they will misunderstand it, or they will just not bother, or they will just get tired partway through. Now, if you've got a flow diagram, anything like this one, like a sequence diagram, these are actually quite easy to get right, because all we need to do is get all of these items up here in the right order. Now, I've seen lots of sequence diagrams where it just goes all over the place and it's jumping, and I think, well, if you just swap those two round, it would make it much easier. So make it so it's nice and easy for people to read. Make sure you're thinking not just about you creating the diagram, but how people are going to read that diagram. Right, this pattern, show them the pirate ship, also known as enthrall your audience with context. Now this one is actually named after Gregor Hope's chapter in his book, The Architect Elevator. Now this is all about enthusing your audience with the context, giving them the information they need to understand it. And so Gregor says, when you look at the cover of a box of Legos, you don't see a picture of each individual brick that's inside. Instead, you see the picture of an exciting, fully assembled model positioned in a lifelike pirate's bay with cliffs and sharks. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, I'm not creating diagrams for children in Lego, but actually, maybe you are. Maybe you are thinking, yeah, the people who I design diagrams for are a bit childlike. But no, lots of people like Lego. And this applies to everybody. Now, maybe you want to talk to people about this flow. It's quite low down. We need to have a meeting about this. There's some disagreement about how this is going to work. But we don't just jump in straight here. We need to start the top level of that data flow. We need to be able to see how this fits in to the context that it's in. But we don't even want to start there. Maybe we need to start with a landscape diagram or something like a C4 context diagram. Maybe we even need to plug another gap with another diagram. We need people to be able to understand what we're actually talking about. And that is when you get someone saying, oh, but how does that relate to this? And they never would have come up with that really important point if they didn't have that context first. If you're only looking at that one diagram, you're going to miss out on things. So one thing you can do is that you can fill the narrative gaps. Put your diagrams in order. Find the gaps where people are going to misunderstand or not understand how things relate to each other. Right, UML again. Not so unified modeling language, also known as using UML when it's not useful. Now, UML can be useful when you're trying to communicate to a particular audience a particular thing. Now, UML diagram types are actually split into structural and behavioral, but you might not know that there's actually 14 different types there, quite a lot. And we tend, if we use any of them, we tend to only use a few of them in anger, things like the class diagram or a sequence diagram. But what you really need to do, going back to what I was talking about at the beginning, is consider your audience. What do they need? Do they need a UML component diagram? I've only ever needed, as a developer and an architect, to create a diagram like this once, and that's this one. It was awful, really awful to create, to try and get all of those little arrows to line up with each other. Yeah, there's no software that does that for you. So what we need to do, keep it simple, straightforward, get that information across to people. This communicates exactly the same information to people. It just does it in really easy to understand language. With a key, even better. Now, traditional UML sequence diagrams are very low level. We're talking about methods. And that's because UML was designed to actually be written and then converted directly into code. But when people use UML today, they do not do that. But they still go into these details. But the problem there is, how long until it goes out of date? Think about when UML was first invented, people were putting code into production maybe once a year. Now we might be doing it multiple times a day. Those methods on that could have actually changed several times in the last week. Who knows? The whole structure of it might be completely different. So what we can do is we can simplify sequence diagrams. Now, my advice is keep your documentation at the highest level of abstraction that you can. Only go into detail when you need to, because the stuff at the high level is the stuff that changes the least, and therefore you have to maintain it a lot less than if you go into lots of detail. So only go into as much detail as people need. And use UML for good reason when you actually really need that kind of information, that kind of low-level technical. Okay. Antipattern, structures behaving badly, or mixing structure and behavior. Now, this is something that UML got right. We should have structural diagrams and behavioral diagrams. If we put them both into one diagram, it can become very confusing and cluttered. So when we've got a diagram like this, no particular notation, because you don't have to use a particular notation, just put a key in, okay? We've got lots of information there. If we take that behavioral information out, it becomes much easier to understand this diagram. This shows us the structure. Then we can pull out that behavior into different behavior diagrams. Now, I created this one using plant UML. Now, this bit of behavioral information is only a tiny bit of the behavior information that was in that first diagram. Because if I put it all onto one diagram, it would be far too much. So if you end up doing this, pulling a diagram apart, you will probably find that you need to create several diagrams. So what we're doing here is we are applying that single responsibility principle, like we do with our code, to our diagrams. Okay, important pattern here, connect the dots. Representational consistency. Sounds a little bit intimidating, it's not. All we need to do is make sure that people can navigate between our different diagrams, our different levels of abstraction. C4 has a nice easy way for us to do this. I said that dark blue box, then it becomes that dotted one. We can navigate either way between these two diagrams and know how that they connect. With data flow diagrams, we use referencing. And so we can see here that we've got the 2, and we've got the 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. Easy to see how these diagrams connect. We've also got the same identifier for the data stores on both of them. So what we really need to do is make those explicit references to the different levels of abstraction, to our different diagrams, to different parts of the documentation. It's not just even between those diagrams. Okay, so as I said, Communication Patterns is a book that I've written with O'Reilly, and all of these ones that I've talked to you about today are some of what you will find in part 1 of the book. So if you're interested in finding out more, then you can check out the book's website. I also have a limited number of bookmarks with me, which have a 30-day code where you can go and read my book for free. So if you would like one of those, then come and grab one afterwards. And now, just like Gregor said earlier today, can't do a talk without saying the word AI. What is AI going to do for diagrams? It's quite interesting. I've developed a new workshop recently where we look at Plant UML and Mermaid and Structurizer, and we compare them all so you can work out what would be the best one to use in a particular situation. But we also have a look at how AI can help us with those different diagrams as code. And that's because although AI is starting to understand visual things now, it's much better at understanding text. And it's quite interesting what it can and can't do. Basically, you need to know exactly what you want it to do and be able to tell it what you want it to do. Very often, it won't know how to do it otherwise. But if you don't really tell it exactly what you want it to do, or you're not particularly sure, quite often you're going to end up with something a little bit like this, which is a detooled sequence dengomam. Now, they are getting a little bit better now, but this is my favorite, which I like to show people. Now, yeah, it's quite a nice color scheme. I quite like the isometric bit, but actually it's all complete nonsense. So I think really our jobs are safe for now. So thank you very much. If you would like to come and talk to me afterwards, feel free. I'm going to be here all week, and you can find me on my website. So thank you.